Det var jo de årene da en hadde nok så sterke indre brytninger. Indre brytninger.
Hei og velkommen til Noen har snakket sammen. Mitt navn Tiril Rustan Halvorsen.
Og jeg heter Aksel Kjellavli.
Vi sitter litt sånn på hver vår kant av landet nå, men podcast blir det.
Ja da, du I Stavanger på økonomisk, så jeg sitter på kontoret som vanlig. Så, men med internett går det meste, vet du.
Ja, ikke sant.
Vi skal ta for oss litt, ja det gjør vi jo av og til da, men enda et sånn stort spørsmål den podcasten her. Et av de store spørsmålene jo hvor mye har egentlig økonomisk vekst å si for et samfunn. Og skal vi tro gjesten I episoden nå, så har det veldig mye å si. Såpass mye at det det definerende trekket ved det århundret vi har bak oss, ifølge han. Og denne episoden så skal vi ta for oss intet mindre enn det 20. århundrets økonomiske historie, og det faktum at vi har lagt denne ekstraordinære epoken bak oss.
Ja, og gjesten vi har med oss heter Brad DeLong. Han professor I økonomi ved Berkeley I California, og var på starten av 90-tallet sentralt plassert I Clinton-administrasjonen. Og han kanskje mest kjent for økonomibloggen. Han har skrevet på nesten daglig siden slutten av 90-tallet. Så vi har med Brad på link fra den andre siden av verden, fra California da, for å snakke om hans siste bok. En murstein ved navn Slouching towards Utopia, an economic history of the 20th century.
Brad DeLong, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
We're very happy to talk to you about your book and a core narrative of your book, at least in my reading, and I guess it's not that far from what you're trying to tell, is that the 20th century is a very special time in the history of the human species because of massive economic growth compared to the past. Humanity has, and this the title of the book is Slouching towards Utopia. You're talking about this long 20th century between 1870 and 2010. What happened exactly in 1870 that makes this such a watershed year that you choose this to open the 20th century?
Well, that three institutions fell into place, right? That you had the development of the Industrial Research Lab, which rationalized and routinized the development of modern science and its application through engineering to discover and develop new, useful human technologies. You had the modern corporation, which then rationalized and routinized the development and deployment of these new technologies. And then you had the coming of the fully globalized world market with the telegraph network, the railroad network, the ocean-going, steam-propellered, iron-hulled steamship. That all of those things made it easy to deploy and made it immensely profitable to diffuse, to copy what others were doing, these technologies around the globe. And that produced something you'd never seen before, that before, humanity had never been able to push the frontier of invention fast enough to more than make up for the fact that growing population was giving us smaller farm sizes and worse raw materials per craftsman. After 1870, technology decisively won its race with human fertility, and we were on the way to a world that was not poor.
And why are exactly these factors, in your view, the defining features of the start of the high growth? And why not other factors like fossil fuel technology or state capacity?
Well, we'd had fossil fuel technology for the steam engine for 160 years before 1870. And, states had been building their capacities to do things for a long time before that. Last week I was down at the University of Southern California talking to an expert on, among other things, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, the great developmental state French minister of Louis XIV in the late 1600s. Different pieces of it had been falling into place, over millennia, ever since we first realized that if you let the barley porridge spoil in a certain way, it turned into beer, which was perhaps the major innovation of the 6000 BCs. But all of that did not produce technological growth fast enough to offset the fact that human populations kept growing, that whenever you got more resources, they tended to go into having more children rather than to raising living standards. After 1870, it did. Look at things from the standpoint of 1870. It's worldwide, it's very much a culture of high patriarchy. And what that means is that if you're a woman, and to a large degree, if you're a man too, if you reach the age of 50 and do not have a surviving son, your social power melts away. You have no one who has voice to advocate for you and care about you. And given that one third of the women who did survive until 50, and not all did, 1 in 7 died in childbed and so forth. If you didn't have that, 1 in 3 women did not have surviving sons by the time they reached the age of 50. That meant that things that would increase human productivity would within a generation or two be accompanied by a rising population. And there you would have better technology, but you'd also have a smaller farm size, or maybe the fisheries would be significantly more crowded. Norwegians had much, much better technologies to try to, farm, fish, hunt, and raise stock in 1870 than they'd had 1,000 years earlier. But the population of Norway was significantly bigger as well. And so, the typical Norwegian in 1870, adult male height on average, something like 5'3" or 5'4", which tells us about massive nutritional insults in childhood. And then from 1870 to 1914, I think the number is that 1 in 4 of Norwegian males leaves Norway for the United States by the time they reach 25, on the grounds that they want to go to a place where there is land, as opposed to staying back in Norway, which, as you know, is not a place where there are a huge number of potential farms. That story of advancing technology, but relatively static and very poor living standards, living standards where you are likely to spend several hours a day thinking about how hungry you are and how much you'd like more calories right now. That was pretty much the human lot after 1870. And it was only after that things began to change.
And of course, this has a huge impact on the macro level of society as well. But if you were to point at just a couple of macro developments that are related to this shift in 1870, what would you point at?
Well, the most immediate downstream one is that, before 1870, there is simply no chance of humanity baking, a sufficiently large economic pie for everyone to have enough, which means that if some people are going to have enough, they're going to have to figure out a way to run a domination and exploitation game, on the rest of society. And so an awful lot of social energy is going to be devoted to figuring out how you can become part of an elite, elbow competing members of the elite to one side, and then get that enough for yourself, and maintain it. Politics and governance, cannot pretty much be anything else. I think the only king of Norway who was ever temporarily buried in England was, Harold Hardrada, Harold Harsh Measures, Harold I will take whatever steps are necessary, Harold the Brutal. And, he had an excellent life up until his unfortunate encounter at Stamford Bridge. He was he was king of Norway. He was a favored lieutenant of the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople. He traveled widely. He was charismatic. But that was because he was an extremely effective thug with a spear. And together with his tame accountants, bureaucrats, and propagandists, he managed to become an elite that did manage to get the enough. While the peasants are living the diets that make their male children 5'3", at adulthood. After 1870, governance and politics can shift from being how does the elite form and then justify itself and maintain its rule, to how can we accelerate the pace of economic growth so that everyone can have enough, and then how can we figure out how to distribute and utilize it, so that people in general and not just an elite can feel safe and secure and live lives in which they're healthy and happy.
We are a center-left podcast, so we are especially interested in parts of the book regarding the center-left, of course.
Yes.
And I wanted to jump forward a couple of decades from the moment we have been talking about now until the end of the Second World War. So we're skipping the part of history that most people are talking about, skipping to the end of the Second World War.
Right.
And at that moment, you had a couple of decades with quite extraordinary economic growth, even in the standard of the 20th century. But you also had the center-left behind the steering wheel of history, so to say. Why was it the center-left that had the power at that time?
There's a strong sense that the center-left actually had the right ideas about how to deal with society and technology as it stood then. I mean, look, you had gone from, say, a feudal mode of production of peasants using hand tools in 1000 to, the gunpowder empire networks of market and commerce in 1650. And by 1870, you were in a steam power economy. And by 1900, you had the second industrial revolution technologies. Come 1945, you're in the age of mass production, with mass unionization and a very large number of workers doing routinized and routine things in factories, on assembly lines. And this means that a world in which you prioritize keeping employment high, a la John Maynard Keynes, produces one in which there is full employment, so even the workers have considerable social power, considerable ability to earn money and to live their lives. And also, full employment is very important for manufacturers simply because of the enormous economies of scale of the assembly line. And so a prioritization of full employment, coupled with the growth of the large social insurance state in order to greatly moderate divisions of income and wealth, that can produce political assent from all fractions of society. Combine that with a willingness to take advantage of the market economy's ability to crowdsource the solutions to social problems, to give people on the ground the opportunity and the social power to establish some organization that will meet a need. Well, as long as market prices are in accord with social values, this is a very effective crowdsourcing mechanism. And so this center-left, say, marriage wedding of Friedrich von Hayek's beliefs about the efficiency and desirability of the market as a crowdsourcing mechanism with something like Karl Polanyi's concern for an economy that supports, that gives social power not just to the rich, to everyone, blessed by the Keynesian commitment to full employment. That hits the sweet spot then and allows for 30 years of economic growth faster than any place the world had ever seen, until the rise of East Asia and of China. Of course, there also was the fact that Joseph Stalin was just on the other side of the Iron Curtain. And all of a sudden, that made pretty much everyone in Western Europe think we have to figure out how to get along, because otherwise the tanks of the Red Army will come through the Fulda Gap, and there where will we be? And so certainly a region that had been one of the most, where politics had been perhaps certainly among the most brutal and among the most bloody of anywhere in the world up until 1945. Everyone pretty much sat down and behaved, for 30 years, until the coming of the 1970s, when that social democratic institutional complex began to unravel.
I think for many of our listeners, social democracy will be very connected to the Nordic model, and we think that's a very special phenomenon for our part of the world and our countries here up in the north.
Your Swedish neighbors will keep telling me that for me to call it a Keynesian concern with full employment is a misnomer, because the Stockholm School had it first, and in fact had it better.
But would you describe Roosevelt's era in America as a social democracy?
It's a kind of limping social democracy. That that America has, I would call it, three foundations, right? And all of the foundations are that we are a people who have come from elsewhere and want to avoid the mistakes and the rigidities and the oppressions and the hierarchies, that come from that were there and elsewhere, that we have fled from. Mm-hmm. And there's, say, a Massachusetts strain, which that we are here to be a very godly, communal people who cares for each other, and we are to advance toward utopia as a group, kind of like a church being holy and keeping ourselves holy and moving forward that way in an egalitarian way. Although the definition of holiness changes enormously as time passes. That what you have to do to be a moral and sober person changes from generation to generation. Then there's, call it, the Virginia side, which is we've come here to escape from a government that oppresses us by keeping us from doing things. So we get to do exactly what we want to here with nobody telling us not to, that's freedom. And that is the kind of utopia we want, the libertarian utopia. And then there's the Kentucky, which is beyond that we're also a people who live on the frontier very close to nature, very much close to self-sufficient, that we can shoot a squirrel 200 yards away with our own rifles regularly and then boil up stew and then take off its pelt and use that to sew ourselves a coat. And that kind of closeness to land and self-sufficiency is another very strong part of the deep American culture. And the first of these fits very well with social democracy. The other two do not. And Roosevelt, kind of the New Deal order, got as close to social democracy in a Nordic sense as the United States can get. But, there's University of Cambridge historian Gary Gerstle has a very nice book on the rise and fall of the neoliberal order, which starts with the fall of the social democratic order of the New Deal order in the United States in the 1970s. One that was echoed by center-right, former Cato Institute, intellectual Brink Lindsay, I think yesterday afternoon in a review of my book, about how there was enormous discontent with social democracy in the United States on the right and on the left in the 1970s. With the discontent on the left coming from that was over-regimented, over-bureaucratized, excessively prone to powerful and organized interest groups managing to achieve rent-seeking positions in society, in which they gathered but did not scatter, in which they took but did not produce. And that in the United States, at least, a great deal of the Reagan movement was precisely that we need to provide, more freedom, but not just to produce, but to experiment and to explore. And that, kind of the Massachusetts conformity and the social democratic bureaucracy were things that you would not expect to be a stable political economic outcome in the United States for long.
This is partly what I had as my next question, that how much of the fall of the social democratic era is ideational, and how big part of it is material in a sense, because on the one hand, you refer a lot to Karl Polanyi in your book, writing of certain rights that he thinks that humans have and that they will revolt if they are not taken care of, that being the right to a stable community, the right to a suitable income, and so on and so on. And you could understand the fall of social democracy or the social democratic era in the 70s, 80s as people on the right and partly on the left feeling that those kinds of ideas are being violated through the social democratic system. Or you can understand it as sort of the high growth system falling apart through the OPEC shock. And so on. So I wonder, how much do you think it makes sense to understand it as material, and how much ideational?
Well, I would actually like to hide from that argument. And I would like to put up Paul Krugman on the side of saying it was all just the OPEC and the Iranian revolutionary shock. That those producing an inflation outbreak that was badly handled, and you add to that the fact that that a depression is very bad for those who become unemployed and can't find new jobs. But for almost everyone else, it's a source of fear. And for employers, it's actually a benefit, provided they can still find customers, because nobody dares quit. But inflation, everyone feels the economy has betrayed them, because everyone feels they have a right to buy things at the prices they expected. And lo and behold, the prices are not what they expected. And so an outburst of inflation, especially one that continues for a long time, even if it's not a huge inflation, even if it doesn't render your money worthless, is going to make people think that the governing system is incompetent, and should be replaced. And Paul Krugman is very much on the side that Reagan and Thatcher were only able to take power because of the OPEC inflation. And they then made a lot of promises, none of which they fulfilled, except for producing a much more unequal distribution of income. And we should go back to social democracy, because that's where we really ought to be. Maybe with some less rent-seeking and some more curbing of overpowerful unions and some debureaucratization and so forth. But that, we really had it good then. And people like Adam Tooze on the other, who are very much, that we are puppets to the structural forces of history, and it was the structural forces of history that did it. And they did it because ultimately, social democracy was unsustainable, in that it gave out too many claims on the resources that society was producing to too many people. And when eventually people showed up with those claims, they found they were not valid, and that you needed to move to a new system in which there would be proper balance between the claims that society was saying people have on what was being produced by society and the simple amount of the claims that was being written. Indeed, I think my attempt to duck this thing and to say that I am more on the side of chance and contingency, but that's probably because I was working in government in a medium level throughout the period at various times, and people who work for government have always imagined they have more power than they do. That I think that seems to have annoyed Adam Tooze enormously in his FT review, that he very much wants us all to be on the structural side.
You served in the treasury of the Clinton administration in the early 90s, and Clinton is famous for a lot of things, but also for saying that the era of big government is over.
It is.
And looking back, why do you think that the 90s, the center left, accepted this quite a big part of the agenda of the 80s, right?
Why in the 1950s did President Dwight D. Eisenhower, it was a very conservative man in his view about what the best society would be. Why did he explicitly say that the only way I can maintain a legislative majority and govern is if I say I am going to be a much better administrator of the New Deal than any Democrat can be? largely because I do not really believe in all these programs. And so I look at them with a skeptical eye, rather than accepting whatever different factions of the Democratic coalition demand as their due. That I am going to spend the government's money on things we really need, like high technology and a nationwide highway system, rather than on what is convenient to Democratic interest groups. And he made that case, and he won 2 terms as presidency. Similarly, Bill Clinton, said, well, I accept that the New Deal, that big government got too big and too bureaucratic and too vulnerable to rent-seeking groups, and that tax rates were too high, and entrepreneurs were not well enough treated in terms of being able to keep the money they made, and that too many people who were actually not contributing the appropriate level of effort to society were getting too many of the benefits that social democracy hands out to people by virtue of their right as citizens, rather than by virtue of their work as deserving them. And I accept that. But still, I am going to implement neoliberalism in very much a kinder, gentler way. That I'm going to be a much better steward of it than are the people who hold that greater income inequality is a feature rather than a bug. That those who are not rich deserve to be poorer. And, there was this attempt to find, you can either call it an attempt to pretend that neoliberalism was something much nicer than it was. You can pretend it was an attempt to restore the social democratic wolf wearing left neoliberal sheep's clothing. You can pretend that they were confused, but there was George H.W. Bush ran for president saying he was going to be wanted a kinder, gentler America. Bill Clinton wanted to make the social insurance state run much more effectively and efficiently and to end welfare as we know it. Even George W. Bush, promised that he was not going to be the kind of ideological neoliberal that Ronald Reagan was, at least at the start, before he threw off the mask. And that view of, achieving a point of balance was a common one in the 1990s. But Al Gore lost the 2000 presidential election 5 Supreme Court votes to 4, with 0 of the Republican Supreme Court justices willing to say, well, if the vote in Florida is impossible to really tell, the fact that the nationwide popular vote is very heavily for the Democratic candidate should have some weight. Nick Clegg, come 2008, decided that the purpose of the Liberal Democratic Party is to provide a way for people who won't vote for the Conservative Party in Britain to nevertheless get the Conservative Party in Britain back into power. And what was it? The income gap between Norway and Britain was something like 15% in 2007, and now I think it's something like 35%. It's an absolutely amazingly catastrophic relative downfall in terms of the strength of the British economy. As austerity took its enormous toll, which was then followed by the attempt to break most of your commercial links with most of your natural trading partners, all because Boris Johnson had originally thought that he wanted to pose as the defender of England against a cosmopolitan Europe, and that the right way to do that was to push for British exit from the European Union and lose, and then had absolutely no idea what to do when he won. Even attempts to revive social democracy could not gain durable political majorities, at least not in the United States and the United Kingdom and on continental Europe. And it was in large part because the era of mass production had been succeeded by the era of global value chains. And you no longer had the large base of unionized workers, who saw themselves as having very large interests in common with other unionized workers like them, who also spent an awful lot of their time on assembly lines doing jobs like the one that they did.
So essentially, as I hear your argument, is that economic growth is front and center in understanding the political history as well of the 20th century. And you mentioned Eisenhower, and he is managing a New Deal era with super high growth, so that he wanted to continue this way of doing politics is quite understandable if you look it through that lens, because he wants to deliver growth, and the current system delivers growth. But with Thatcherism, Reaganism, the system does not deliver what it says that it is to deliver.
Yeah, that harder incentives were supposed to re-empower the engine of economic growth, and providing more money to the wealthy was supposed to boost investment. You were also supposed to reattain the moral center of society, in which people worked harder, because there wouldn't be this featherbed safety net for people who did not work hard. Plus, there was supposed to be a moral revival of people behind, Lutheran or Calvinist beliefs about how one led a sober life. And the whole thing was also supposed to produce a more unequal income distribution, so that the rewards to the rich for working harder and truly becoming job creators were greater, and the penalties to the poor for not working hard were greater as well. And yet, in the global north, all the neoliberal turn managed to deliver was the very last of these, which is why nobody likes it right now. Although I must say, looking around, many of the other things that on offer look considerably worse. Now, as my friend Yingyi Qian says, that if you look at the global south, the value of the neoliberal turn looks significantly different, because there it powers the shift from Maoism to Deng Xiaoping's developmental state in China. And it also powers, the Rajiv Gandhi, Manmohan Singh shift away from the British Labour Party-inspired post-World War II license Raj, of extremely heavy-handed government planning of industry at a very detailed level to try to make the distribution of income and wealth equal, which wound up doing little more than hobbling it and making the distribution of wealth corrupt. Meanwhile, Norway, Denmark, and Sweden are all doing very, very well indeed, even though people grumble about how Norway would perhaps not be doing so well were it not for the location of natural gas fields, and how Denmark would not be doing so well if it weren't, in fact, right next to Hamburg.
Then we would both be like Sweden.
Well, yes, there is that. Yes. No, it isn't. It's an argument that's often made, but it's not a terribly strong argument. The people used to say that Finland was doing well because it was the source of engineering talent and construction management for the Soviet Union, and that the collapse of the Soviet Union would mean the collapse of the Finnish economy as well. And yet that did not happen either.
On the timeline through the 20th century, we are moving closer and closer to the end of the 20th century, and you place the end in 2010, which is not the year 2000, which makes sense in a mathematical sense. And it's not 1991 that Eric Hobsbawm, the historian, is famous for placing it at because of the fall of the Soviet Union. So I wonder, why is 2010 so fundamental that you move it away from the mathematical year 2000 and away from 1991?
Maybe 6 things happen. They happen gradually. They happen on either side of 2010. But like our generation of dithering about dealing with global warming comes to an end, and global warming becomes very much a first order problem that has to be dealt with now. This year, I think the monsoon is 300 miles away from normal, which means that Pakistan is underwater and the Yangtze River is 6 meters lower of where it's supposed to be. And there are 3.5 billion people in Asia whose lives depend on the monsoon being in the right place at the right time, in the right volume, at the right temperature. And we're destabilizing the global climate in a way that is going to matter, and is going to matter a lot. And we really do need to deal with this over the next generation. And so that's a global challenge that, a neo-Malthusian global challenge that we did not face at any time during the 20th century. When, yes, there was industrial pollution, but it was relatively localized. And when countries decided it was time to clean up their act, they could indeed clean up their act and deal with smog and deal with dirty water and so forth. So that's one. The second is we really do seem to see a significant slowdown in the rate of technological progress after 2007 or so. That the complex of industrial research labs supported by governments pushing forward technology becomes harder and harder to maintain, in large part because of neoliberal financiers saying, why is my company funding this thing when most of its benefits are spillovers to elsewhere? And that slowdown in the rate of frontier economic growth is a big deal. It changes the tenor of how society is moving forward, because it's no longer the case that each generation is about twice as wealthy, as the previous one. The third is that forms of religious war and terrorism that we thought we had more or less outgrown with the death of Gustav Adolf, King of Sweden, who sent Swedish troops all the way south of Bavaria in order to convince Bavarians that they ought to be good Protestants. That we stopped doing that, or at least Europeans stopped doing that after 1648, by and large. But lo and behold, murder and war in the interest of we're going to make you worship God in the right way, is back. And that was number 3. Number 4 was between 1870 and 2000. The world basically ran with first the United Kingdom and then the United States, saying we see a future world of much greater peace, much greater trade, and much greater prosperity. And we understand that as we're the largest economy and the dominant one in international trade, that we need to play a role in pushing forward this world moving toward a more global, more open, more unified human society. And with the coming of the George W. Bush administration, that very much falls away, and the U.S. begins acting much more just like we're just another great power, and does not materially move back. In fact, moves kind of further. And that under Trump, the United States is not just another great power, it turns into a strange chaos monkey, at least with respect to every European politician saying these people are not rational, they're not going to be trusted. That's up to 4, I think. Number 5 is with the coming of 2007 to 2010, it became clear that all of the rules of economic management to try to maintain a full employment economy, that those lessons had been forgotten, or rather that because those lessons were inconsistent with the neoliberal view that the market was producing good outcomes all by itself, and to interfere with the market outcomes was to commit a kind of sin, that fell away. And so we had this extremely bizarre first half of the 2010s when the global north is very, very far indeed away from full employment, and everyone is essentially just sitting on their hands, worrying not about how do we get back to full employment, but how do we make sure that the Greeks are properly punished for having dared to borrow too much. And then number 6, we have in the 2010s the revival of forms of ethno-authoritarianism that we thought had been buried in the 1940s. That all 6 of those make the story of the world after 2010, a different story than the story of technology racing forward, of humanity learning to bake a sufficiently large economic pie for everyone to have enough, but our inability to figure out ways to slice and taste the pie, to equitably distribute our wealth, and then utilize it to create a world in which people feel safe and secure and are healthy and happy.
Quite a bleak and depressing era to live in.
There are still 8 billion of us. And collectively, we are very smart and capable, and we do have magnificent technologies to deploy. And recent improvements in closed and non-carbon technologies are truly wonderful. And even though individually each of us is too dumb to reliably remember where we left our keys last night, as a group, if we properly process what we're thinking, we can be quite intelligent.
This end of the 20th century that you sort of place in 2010, does it also mark a start of, on a ideas level, a start of a post-neoliberal era? One could point to, for example, Tyrell quoted Bill Clinton on saying that the era of big government is over, and I was quite amused with James Medlock, the Twitter pseudonym, saying that the era of big government is over. Yeah. And he was, I saw he was quoted by Paul Krugman, among others, on that one. You could maybe place, I don't know if you see Bidenism as something post-neoliberal.
People keep saying that the era of neoliberalism is over, and yet it keeps galumphing along in its strange way. Supply side progressivism, developmentalism, neo-fascism, ethno-nationalism of one kind, the Chinese challenge, that Friedrich von Hayek's market is fine, but that it needs to have a Leninist party. Coupled to a Confucian, a Master Kung view of the responsibility of governance to actually work. That after all, if you went into a restaurant and if Xi Jinping was its manager, you might say, God, this is a nasty guy, but at least the food will be cooked well and will come out on time. If you go into a restaurant and it's Boris Johnson or Donald Trump who's the manager, you will turn around and leave. You would say, I don't want to get food poisoning. I don't know what's going on back in the kitchen. That yes, that the neoliberal turn seems to have spoiled, but what will replace it now is very unclear, and I do not, in fact, see any significant political movement that has a potential mass base to replace it. So I'd say it's an era of confusion rather than an era of renewal. But then John Maynard Keynes said the same thing in the 1920s, and we did indeed get, the renewal of social democracy in the 1930s.
It's tempting to say, look to Norway.
It is,
but even here, growth is flattening out. The final question has to be, what now? How can we bring back the high growth from the last century? Is that even possible, or do we need some kind of new revolutionary technology or something?
Well, I think first we really need to deal with global warming, right? That moving as fast as possible to stop pumping more carbon and methane into the atmosphere. It's going to be much, much more expensive to clean up the consequences afterwards than it is to simply stop it now. So a decade during which the world economy does not grow very much, but during which we move to net zero, would be a very wise investment for the human race to make over the next decade. After that, well, we have wonderful technologies potentially on the horizon in terms of information and biotechnology. The problem is they require investments at a truly extraordinary scale, at the scale beyond any individual company, in order to push them forward. And so we need a unified global effort. And then we very much need to think hard about how we are going to make these technologies useful for us. When I was young, I would read science fiction novels, and some of them would have futures of marvelous technology and humanity of immense power to do and accomplish things. And others would have worlds in which people were brainwashed and terrified by propaganda messages coming through their televisions, and worlds in which killer robots were stalking the skies looking for targets. And, I kind of thought I might grow up. I didn't think any of these worlds would come in my lifetime. And it seems that all three have. Right now, I do indeed have elderly relatives who are being terrified by what comes through their screens. All because people think if they can glue their eyeballs to the screen, they can sell them ads for fake diabetes cures and crypto funds. And as we know, there are killer robots stalking the skies over Ukraine and Syria right now.
Not a positive, optimistic answer.
Sorry. Sorry. Look.
Crushing all our dreams.
Look. Even 170 years ago in Norway, your children, your boys would be 5'3" at adulthood. And, that would be a sign of how malnourished they were. And half of them would die before the age of 5. And, I don't know what having only enough calcium and protein to make you 5'3" at adulthood, what that does to early childhood and in utero brain development. But it's unlikely not to do anything. Right? That, my great-grandmother in the 1960s, back then, she asked my mother if she'd lost any teeth when she was pregnant with me. The idea that pregnancy used to be something in which there's a fight over the calcium, right, between the baby and the mother, and usually the baby wins to the extent of one or two of the mother's teeth. And we're not in that world anymore, and that's a very nice thing.
Let's end on that more positive note. Brad, thank you so much for joining the podcast.
You're very welcome.
Thank you. Ja, da må vi også anbefale noe. Du anbefalte jo denne Liz Truss-streamen forrige gang, Aksel.
Jeg følte meg passe dum akkurat i det vi trykte av record, fordi Liz Truss gikk av mens vi spilte inn podcasten. Men gjort var gjort, så... Ja. Jeg veldig glad for at jeg veddet for salaten. Ja, ikke sant.
Men anbefalingene denne uka vel knyttet til like mye spenning, men ikke like høy risiko, for vi ganske sikre på at det kommer til å skje. Agenda arrangerer valgvake for folketingsvalget i Danmark 1. november, fra klokken 6 på Youngstorget i Oslo. Så der kan du følge med på valginnspurten og høre blant annet Bjørgulf Brånen, Simon Dyr og Asbjørn Sonne Nørgaard, som fra den danske tankesmien Sevea.
Et bra tips.
Yes.
Mitt jo litt da i samme gata. Det jo ikke bare Danmark som har valg, det har også USA. Den 8. november så det kongressvalg, og det skal velges mer enn 400 medlemmer av representantenes hus, 34 senatorer og 36 guvernører. Så det jo da det såkalte mellomvalget også da. Og der det jo da valgvake som Tankesmien Agenda arrangerer igjen på Jungs i Oslo, sammen med den norske Atlanterhavskomité. Og det skjer da den 8. november, altså en uke etter det danske valget, klokka 7:30 på kvelden.
Og til og med før disse valgvakene skjer, så det jo andre runde i det brasilianske. Så for de som vil høre seg litt opp på det, så hadde vi en episode for noen uker siden om det. Og det blir minst like spennende.
Absolutt, valg går vi aldri lei av. Eller noe. Ja, men da snakkes vi neste uke da, Aksel. Det gjør vi. Ha det bra.
Ha det.